As Ted and Martha drive to Frank's place, they're glad and they're content to have such a wonderful and generous friend. They've come for lunch, and as is usual, they've brought something to share. But as they pull up, they have to park a little further down the road than usual because there are cars lining the street. There's a couple of cars in Frank's driveway, and there's one actually even pulled up on his front lawn. With horror, Ted and Martha realise that there are going to be extra people to feed, and they certainly haven't brought enough. Hesitantly, they knock on the door, and as it opens, they see a room full of people, and suddenly this dish to feed 3 in Ted's hands looks very small. "Come on in," Frank says, "and meet some of the folks from work. I thought it would be nice to have some more friends for lunch." Now, Martha and Ted are a little bit annoyed about this, since they haven't been given a chance to prepare properly. But as they enter the kitchen, their worries are allayed. The benches are full of salads, and there's a pile of meat that is stacked up and clearly meant to be done on the barbecue. "It's okay," Frank says, "I've got enough, and I reckon we're going to have stacks left over." Now, it's not the perfect analogy, but if you can relate to the emotions that Ted and Martha might have felt, you might understand the disciples in today's gospel reading. A family story. Am I allowed to tell it? Yeah. Marie's mum once invited people home after church, said, "Come home for lunch even if we only have sardines on toast." And what do you know, when they got home, that was all that was in the house, so they had sardines on toast for lunch. I mean, they had a good time and all, but it's that sense of we don't have enough. The story, though, starts, one of the early verses of our story today that we shouldn't miss, is it starts like this. "Then Jesus went up a mountainside and sat down with his disciples." The text tells us that there were crowds who were following Jesus because of the healings they had seen. But Jesus chooses to take a special time and a special place to sit down with his disciples. He takes the time to give them special instruction and individual attention. And we hear this throughout the gospel, that Jesus, yes, had a public ministry to the crowds, but he also took time specifically with his disciples where he nurtured them even more. There's an intimacy in this, where Jesus shares himself with those who are closest to him. And that's what we are doing today. As disciples of Jesus, this is our special time as we gather in his presence, as we hear his word, as we receive the food that he has to give. Jesus shares himself with us. We gather here as friends of Jesus so that we can know him and even share ourselves with him in return. It's important that we don't forget what an incredible privilege this is. That we perhaps, as we sit here, feel the warmth of knowing that Jesus wants to be with us. Before we get too far into the rest of the story, I need to point out that the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6 is just the beginning of a whole dialogue that takes the rest of John chapter 6, where Jesus holds himself out to be the bread of life. Over the next several weeks, actually, the gospel reading each Sunday is going to take one step further in the journey of what Jesus says about himself as the bread of life. And it's important to realize as we deal with this, that although the people come to Jesus looking for physical bread, although they come, and we get hints of this even in today's story, they come looking for a political kingship, but Jesus' interest is on holding himself out as the spiritual bread from heaven and the bread of life. John notes that this is the the time of the Passover. And so this feeding of the 5,000 takes place in a time which is meant to resonate with the Passover themes of deliverance, of the presence of God, of leading people out of their captivity into the freedom of the worship of God. It's fundamentally not about the bread. Even back in John's day, it wasn't about the bread. Yes, there was a miracle, but John holds it out not just as a miracle, something physical that happened that was amazing, but he holds it out as a sign. It's something physical that happened that was amazing and is meant to point to something else. And like all signs, if you spend your time just staring at the sign, you've missed the point about what the sign is pointing to. This is fundamentally not about bread, it's about relationship with Jesus. And so Jesus gathers today with his disciples in this place. Every time you read his word, every time you pray, Jesus gathers with you in intimacy and wants to draw you to himself. But in doing so, the crowd is not forgotten. Jesus' attention is not solely focused on those who are gathered here closest to him, those within the walls of this building. In this case, in John chapter 6, it's true that the crowd comes to Jesus and really they are looking for the wrong things. They're missing the sign. But Jesus is, despite that, still concerned for their welfare. The heart of Jesus is not just for his friends. It's not just for his disciples and those gathered here. It's not just for you and me. Jesus looks up and he sees the crowd. Today, still, Jesus looks up and out and he sees the crowd. He looks to the houses across the road. He looks to the people on the hill opposite. He looks at our businesses and commerce centres. He notices the children in our schools and in our childcare centres. He sees the elderly alone at home. He sees the families of the area and in your lives with all joy, with all their struggles, and in this area sometimes with all their financial hardships. They may not yet be his disciples, but Jesus looks up and he sees them and he cares for them. And that's where our story starts to get a little daunting. Perhaps even a little threatening. Because Jesus turns to his disciples and he says to them, "Where are we to buy bread so these people may eat?" Jesus' concern for our friends, our neighbours, our community puts us in the same situation as Ted and Martha and as Philip and Andrew. Jesus asks his disciples, how are we to meet their needs? That "we" creates nervousness, doesn't it? Jesus, on the one hand, gives us the gift of being with us, and on the other hand, he wants to involve us in his work. And that leads us to wonder whether we are up for it. With the enormity of the crowd around us and all the needs that we see, it is easy to feel overwhelmed. I recently had a conversation with a young man who said something like this. It was, God does not need our ministries, but he desires them. Now there's a whole bunch of thinking wrapped up in that phrase, and just a few of the things that occur to me. God does not need our ministries, but he desires them. First of all, we reflect on the fact that God does not need our ministries. Let's remember that God is not incapable of acting if we don't act. We're not doing God a favour by our endeavours. If we choose to abandon our posts, God can act in other ways. I guess it just means that we miss out. But secondly, here in that also this note of comfort, knowing that if we try and do not succeed, then our failure does not lead to the failure of God's kingdom. And what that means is that we are able to experiment. We are able to give it a go. We are able to try things for the first time. We are able even to fail and still know that God's kingdom is advancing. Sometimes God's kingdom advances, Jesus says, like yeast working its way through a lump of dough. It's unseen, but it's powerful. And sometimes as we try new things and they fail, we don't see it, but God's kingdom advances anyway. We, in working for God, don't have to take on the whole responsibility for making sure that this works out, because when we do that, we become afraid to act in case we fail. God actually frees us from that. He doesn't need us to do it. He doesn't need us to succeed in order for His will to be done. But here's the other side of that coin. God doesn't need our ministry, but God desires it. God gives us the privilege and the opportunity to work alongside Him and to be His instruments. God gives us our gifts, our influences, our unique selves, our network of relationships. He gives us these things so that we can live for Him and have an impact on this world for the sake of the kingdom. God could do it by other means, but He desires that intimacy with you so much that He wants to do it with you. We can please God by serving Him. He honours us by giving us roles to do in the world. And again, what that means is that we are free to give it a go. We are free to try. We're free to experiment. We are free to fail, even knowing that God desires our ministry and He rejoices in everything that we attempt for His sake. He wants us to be with Him as He is with us. But it's all very well that Frank is confident that Martha and Ted will bring food for lunch and contribute to the feeding. However, Martha and Ted sometimes do still have that sinking feeling, that terror of inadequacy they feel from not having enough to feed everybody. Even if they were to go home and raid their fridge, still wouldn't have enough. And Philip, in our gospel reading, tells Jesus that even 200 days' wages would not be enough for this many people to get even a little. Jesus asks Philip, "How will we help?" And Philip replies, "It's not even worth trying." It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the need around us and God's calling on our lives. If we follow Jesus' gaze out into the streets, if we follow His gaze into our shopping centres and into the homes of our friends and neighbours, we will see far more need than we can meet. When Jesus asks us how we are to meet those needs, we too can feel threatened and inadequate. And sometimes what that means is that we then pretend that we haven't heard the question, because we don't think that we have an answer. It's just easier to say, "I haven't heard the call," rather than to admit that I can't respond to it. Perhaps, like Andrew, we might start to grasp at a straw or two along the way. There's a boy here who's got 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they for so many? You see, this response is actually a little better, isn't it? At least Andrew takes seriously the attempt to do something. He has perhaps just the first glimmerings of positivity, the first glimmerings of a faith that thinks that maybe something could be done. And he, and presumably also the young boy himself, whose lunch it is, are prepared to take what they have and to put it at the disposal of Jesus. He takes that step, that first glimmerings of faith, but then is overwhelmed by the need and says, "But what are they for so many?" So what's the right response to Jesus' question? Jesus says, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" And perhaps Philip and Andrew might have given vent to their feelings at being stuck with such an impossible question. It seems to me like a perfectly legitimate answer would be, "God only knows." And if only they had said that, they would have been right. Only God knows what can be done. The mistake that Philip and Andrew make is that when they come to the end of their own resources, they don't come back to Jesus to see what can be done. They take his questions, where can we buy bread? And they interpret it only as if it said, "What are you going to do?" It's a mistake of Martha and Ted in thinking that what they've brought for lunch is all that there is. It's the mistake that we make when we think that our human effectiveness is all that there is, and we forget to ask God to provide and do his will through us. A secret of Christian ministry is this: you probably are not going to be adequate for all the needs that come your way. Time and time again, you will be faced with situations to which you have no answer, or maybe only stumbling answers. You've got no idea what to do. You'll be faced with situations where you're simply asked to turn up and to be inadequate. And that's okay, because in your inadequacy, God is adequate. You see, right from the very start, the Gospel of John tells us that when Jesus asks his impossible question, he said this in order to test his disciples, because he himself knew what he was going to do. All along, Jesus is and has been in control of the situation. As Jesus asks the impossible question about how to feed the crowd, Jesus himself knows that he is going to feed the crowd. I suspect that the text here really means us to understand that Jesus knows that there's a young boy who has these loaves and fish, and that he's going to break it, and it's going to be distributed to the people, and that they are going to have more than enough to eat themselves, and they're going to gather up the scraps afterwards. Jesus knows what resources we bring to the table, and Jesus knows what resources he brings to the table. The question being raised here for the disciples is not really a question about what resources they have. It's a question of whether they're willing to put them at Jesus' disposal and to see what he can do with them. Will we trust Jesus enough to use what we have for him? Jesus will do what Jesus will do, but he honours us by desiring us to work with him by doing what we can do. In the end, of course, we can't meet the needs of the whole community around us. But if we offer Jesus to them, we will make the difference that really matters. The way the feeding of the 5,000 works out is that the physical needs of all the people are met and there is plenty left over. But the significance of the feeding of the 5,000 is that in that feeding, Jesus gives an image and a parable of himself as the bread of life. And that offer is enough. Jesus truly grants life with God and eternal life. Jesus accomplishes all this, and he knows he is going to do it, and to that extent he doesn't need our ministry, but Jesus desires your ministry. He desires your partnership. He desires your efforts so that he can do these things with you. The very God who sits with us and dwells with us in intimate connection here in this place wants us also to live in intimate connection with him as he serves the world around us. He wants us to be a part of what he is doing because he wants us to be with him in the world. You know, there's a really common catchphrase these days that you'll have heard it because it's becoming more and more common. It's important for people's self-esteem to know you are enough. And that's absolutely true. Because of his love for you, you are enough for God. And if you are enough for God, then you are enough. But there is another sense in which, of course, we also have to say we're not enough. We don't have enough to meet the needs of those around us. But again, come back, because what we do have is Jesus. Jesus is enough. What Jesus is looking for from us is our involvement. He seeks our commitment to give what we have, so that even if we can only give a little, like Andrew and the child, it is enough. And it's enough because at the deepest level, what Jesus really is seeking is our faith and our trust that when he invites us, what are we going to do? He is able to do what needs to be done. During this week, I read a prayer letter from someone who is sharing Jesus' love in another nation. Over and over again, as I've read their letters, they seem to be learning that despite discouragement, despite limited resources and opportunities, God has a plan and a purpose, and God gives strength for the journey. They wrote about this lesson of giving to God and what we have, and giving to God what we have and trusting that Jesus will be sufficient. Here's what they wrote just this last week. It is not us who can do anything in this hard soil, but our God has given us the strength we need to follow him in this very moment, and he is with us. If this place yields fruit, it is for his glory. If not, it is his will, though I trust there is a remnant chosen by his grace. May we remain faithful in him till the end. Today, for the disciples of Jesus, this is what the feeding of the 5,000 comes down to. Jesus is enough. And with Jesus, we have enough. And therefore, with Jesus, we are enough. Jesus invites us to share life with him and to share in ministry with him. It's not that he couldn't do it without us, but it is that he loves to do it with us. As we gather here in the intimacy of worship with Jesus, he embraces us and he shares himself with us. And as we leave this place, Jesus embraces us and invites us to continue that intimacy as we join with him in sharing him with others. Jesus doesn't expect us to change the world, but he invites us to share what we have in service with him so that he can change the world. Amen.